Oh, hey, what's up, guys? Wasn't gonna do a live video tonight, but someone in the friend of mine in Twitter actually said that, um, "Are you doing a live video tonight?" I really wasn't going to, but I might as well do one. Why not? Um, in this video, I'm going to talk about the history of Al Qaeda, and reason why is because a lot of people are not uh, fully understanding of who the organization is, what they're about, and how they started. All you really know about it is that they were initially a terrorist organization that conducted numerous terrorist operations in the mid 1990s and, of course, 9/11. But that's not the whole story. And I figure I'd talk about it here at some length and let you know about the initial stages and what was the reasoning behind the creation of Al Qaeda, which was we'll have to go back to 1986. Uh, Osama bin Laden back in 1986 was initially uh, a student at the King Fahd Mosque in Saudi Arabia, where he was studying electrical engineering. He had no ties to any religious militants except through his family and his brother, who were allegedly involved in the Grand Mosque seizure that happened a couple of years prior in 1979. Uh, there was allegedly some influence between the bin Laden family and what was happening at the mosque, in which we saw some Sunni radical dissents, including one uh, Muhammad al Khattabi, Juliman al Khattabi, who basically thought himself as the Mahdi, or the next Mahdi, which is the savior. Um, the problem with that was that they raided the mosque in the hopes of raising awareness and the change of uh, the Saudi Arabian government, which they considered non-Islamic, which is ironic in itself, that they feared that Saudi Arabia was becoming too westernized. And this is where bin Laden came into his initial contact with the militancy of the Wahhabi ideology itself. Um, But in 1986, Bin Laden was using his father's um, construction machines to build roads and ditches in Afghanistan during the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and he was considered a hero for doing this. Here's a guy who's a multimillionaire at this point, was one of the six sons who were in charge of the Bin Laden, Saudi Bin Laden group, which is the largest construction magnate in all of Arabia. Um, but here's a guy who was willing to give up uh, the riches to be with the Afghans and the Arabs in their fight against a superpower like the Soviet Union. And so bin Laden had started construction in the Jaji region of Khost, Afghanistan. Um, and the reason for building this training camp, which is known as Al Masada, which is also in from the Arabic, it's called the Lion's Den, because it was a strategic importance, and it was situated next to a Soviet fort at Ali Kel, which is a town near the Parchinar Gardez Highway, uh, and there was nobody there, nobody in this area, no Afghan Mujahideen, no really large contingents of Soviets, and he wanted to build this training camp here. And this training camp was important because it is the only training camp that catered to specifically Arabs. During the Afghan Soviet War, the Afghans basically didn't want Arabs in their training camps, and Arabs weren't very good fighters. They weren't good military leaders, um, and Afghans only saw them good for one thing, which was dying, in which the Arabs uh, considered martyrdom as a pathway to Jannah, which is heaven. And so the Arabs started training at this camp called Al Masada through the influence of Osama bin Laden, and who had some connections with another financial office, which was the Maktab al Khidmat, which is the Afghan Services Bureau. Now, this office was a very huge multi building over time. I think it grew to like 8 or 9 buildings in Peshawar, Pakistan. And it catered to the influx of foreign Arabs that were coming in from all over the world at this time to join in the fight, to join in the jihad, which was actually um, the influence of having neighboring Arabs come to the fight was through Abdul Azam, who is a notable Palestinian imam and hafiz, as well as a teacher in the uh, major of Shura Council at the University of Cairo and at the University in Riyadh. And he taught there. He taught um, Shura lessons in both countries. He was well known even before he came to Afghanistan. But he would write many books and he would be influential in uh, translating to the Arabs about the importance of fighting against a secular invader, which is the Soviet Union, and the call for the Ummah, the global Ummah, which is the global community of Muslims, which is called the Ummah. And what he wanted the global community to do, the global Ummah to do, was to create defensive jihad. Jihad initially in the Quran is specifically designed for the fight of the spirit against the sins of the world. The jihad is the struggle within you. Abdullah Azam and other later, earlier Sunni imams, such as Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn Hanbal, Ibn al-Qutmin, and later Muhammad Hassan, the famous Grand Mufti of Saudi Arabia, one time Ibn Baz, and others who now redefined what jihad actually is. And Abdul Azam made famous uh, his interpretation of jihad as defensive jihad, where now it is no longer a spiritual battle, it is a physical battle against the sins of the world, which is the secular invader against an Islamic country such as Afghanistan. This moved Osama bin Laden, who basically, as a student at the university at King Fahd University, he would attend Abdul Azam's speaking lessons, and he actually really enjoyed Abdul Azam while he was sneaking into his classes. And so they met up in Peshawar, Pakistan. Actually, Abdul Azam had traveled to Riyadh to talk with Osama bin Laden about helping to finance the Maktab al Khidmat. And he liked the idea of having an office that trained um, not just in the arts of warfare, but also the religious interpretations that were taught there as well. Basically, the Quran and the Hadith, or the Quran and the Sunnah. Uh, Now, this posed a problem because the neighboring Arabs had a much different theological belief than the Afghans. The Afghans are considered from the Hanafi school. The Hanafi school is much different than um, the like Wahhabi ideology. Um, the Hanafi school is a one of the major traditional Sunni schools of Islamic jurisprudence, and it basically catered to the ideology or the preservation of the disciples of Abu Yusuf and Muhammad al Shabani, uh, which is a Persian point of view. The Hanafi school is um, the madhab, which is the school of thought within fiqh, which has the largest number of adherents, which is one third of Muslims worldwide. So this is a large school of thought within the Muslim community. And the methodology behind this is that the foundational text of the Hanafi madhab credited Abu Hanaf and his students of that school, the initial school, um, which basically caters to the doctrine against non-believers, the distribution of spoils among Muslims and during war, uh, different interpretations of how to deal with apostasy, and they're very traditionalistic. And a lot of the traditions involving these people of the Hanafi background include the traditions um, called Pashtunwali, which long predates Islam, which is basically uh, a tradition basically about the backgrounds of the Afghans, um, the how to treat Muslims in terms of the lifestyles of the Pashtun people, which are basically as and this is really vague here, but I'm not an expert in Pashtunwali laws, but the scholars who have concentrated on this interpret it as the way of the Afghans or the code of life, and it's widely practiced even within the Taliban in the of Afghanistan currently, and even when they first arrived in the country in 1992, and it dates back to pre-Islamic law, times, um, and it's basically a law within these people, which is much different than, say, the laws of Wahhabi Muslims. Wahhabi Muslims see themselves as the puritanical generations of the first two generations of the Prophet Muhammad, in which they think all Muslims should return back to those times and get rid of the more spiritual Muslims, such as Shias, Shiites, Alawites. They consider them heretics and munafiqs. Munafiq is fake Muslim. And this is important because these ideological beliefs shape these Muslims. And this is something you're not going to learn through the legacy media. They'll just demonize Muslims as a whole. Oh, they're all terrorists, they're all fanatics, and they all belong to one predominant school of thought. And that's not true because a majority of Muslims would disagree with bin Laden's theological point of view. And bin Laden's theological point of view is not shared with the majority of Muslims. In fact, a lot of Sunni Muslims consider him a fake Muslim. So bin Laden creates this training camp called Al Masada. And Al Masada was basically a training camp specifically for Arabs. But he had to get permission because the area in which they built was the Jaji area, which was in control of a notable Afghan warlord called Abdul Rasul Sayyaf, who would later become part of the Northern Alliance. Um, but he was a notable warlord with one of the largest armies behind him during the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And bin Laden had to ask for his permission. Now, Rasul Sayyaf, along with Jalaluddin Haqqani, both of these Afghans were the only Afghans who invited Arabs in their ranks to fight against the Soviets. Other Afghan warlords like Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, Abu Haraj al-Iraqi, um, and others did not want Arabs in their ranks. They were predominantly very insular. Afghans are very finicky about and they don't like outsiders at all. And they consider Arabs outsiders. You had to get permission for this. And so they did. And the training base was built. When it was built, the legend has it was that in 1987, 88, there was a fight between the Arabs at Masada, and there weren't that many at the time. At this time, Bin Laden had another Arab camp as well, in Nangarhar province, and a lot of the initial founders of the Al Masada camp had transferred to over there. And so there was about maybe 20 fighters at this Al Masada camp at that time. And so what happened was the Russian special forces, the Spetsnaz, had found out that there were Arabs at this camp and they invaded it. Now, the Spetsnaz are basically the preeminent special forces of the Russian military, and legend has it there were over like 100 to 150 of these fighters against like 20 to 25 of the Arabs at the Al Masada camp. And this is where the legend grew about the camp was that at Al Masada they basically had handguns and swords and knives to fight against the Spetsnaz soldiers who had AK-47s at this point. And throughout the week of the fighting, um, they won. The Arabs at this camp had beaten and didn't kill all these fighters. The Spetsnaz actually retreated back into their contingent, and but the legend grew, and it was enormous. And the Afghans who disrespected the Arabs at one point didn't think of them as nothing. Suddenly heard that they could fight, and that there was an Arab leader who was willing to train these Arabs to fight in small arms fire, in guerrilla training. And his name was Osama bin Laden. And so Osama bin Laden became an even more mythical figure in Afghanistan. And this is something a lot of historians won't tell you. The legacy media surely won't tell you, won't hear in schools. But what I'm telling you is through books, through, you could look at it even through Wikipedia if you want. The origins of Al Masada. There is a book I would recommend to you, which is the best book I've ever read about the initial stages of Al Qaeda. And it was written by Ann Sterenson. And the book is Al Qaeda in Afghanistan. And it's really one of the most important books I've ever read. And to this day, I don't think, I would rank it as the top five most important books I've ever read. It's a very small book. There's only like 200 pages. But Ann Sterenson had lived in Afghanistan and she studied the traditions of the Arabs and the Afghans there for many years and lived amongst even the Taliban at the time. She's a notable um, influence in terrorism interviews, and she's a very authoritative voice. And it actually is important. The book is referenced heavily referenced, and so I would, if you want to know about Al Qaeda and how it started, that's the book to get. Actually, um, nevertheless, let's talk about the war in which the Russians were shocked at this. And so they retreated back, but the word got out that the Arabs can fight. And now, slowly but surely, more Arabs start training at the Al Masada camp and also at the Nangarhar camp at Nangarhar province. But later, that would have ramifications as well through a very notable fight. Um, there was also an Arab camp called Wal Jihad. I spoke about this camp initially yesterday in the other live interview, live video I did. Wal Jihad training camp was in Nangarhar province. Um, and this trained in small arms fire, bomb making, um, guerrilla warfare type tactics. And Afghans would travel here too. They would travel to Al Masad before it closed down. They would travel to the Wal Jihad training camp in Nangarhar province, and they would, learn about guerrilla fighting that the Afghans were basically ignorant about. The Afghans were basically all about symmetry warfare, large scale warfare, how to fight in tanks, anti aircraft weaponry, large weapons like AK-47s, M50s, M15s, or whatever. Larger weapons that would, and also strategic guerrilla warfare, which they were excellent on. There's an old saying with the Afghan. There's an old Afghan saying uh, in the during the Soviet invasion of war was that the Soviets may have the watches, but the Afghans have the time. And so that's how the Soviets lost because the Afghans just basically waited them out, and they lost because the Afghans were fighting against the hills, the mountains. The Russians weren't trained for this. It's a brutal landscape in Afghanistan too, a brutal winter, a brutal summer, and they're not prepared for this because they're basically are not used to fighting against contingents of armies who are willing to die in the battlefield, and they don't care about it. There was a famous Russian general, I can't think of his name, in which he says, "How do you defeat an enemy when the enemy is running at you, waiting to die?" Yeah, that would pose a formidable enemy, wouldn't it? Um, so fast forward um, to the myth of the battle. So at around this time, the Soviets were negotiating a peace treaty with Pakistan in trying to get out of the country at this time because at this time it was really just a loss. In the late 1980s, uh, the CIA became involved through Operation Cyclone, which was the largest CIA operation in history. Started using the Pakistan ISI, the Pakistan intelligence services, as a conduit to funnel Stinger missiles, which was used by the Afghans to shoot down aircraft by the Russians, which basically gave the Russians the upper hand in the early 1980s, and it looked like the Soviets were gaining ground. But after the Carter administration, the Reagan administration came in, and through their national security advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski, who wrote an outline about how the United States had to be the only superpower to control Eurasia and the Middle East, and that was book was called The Grand Chessboard, and it basically outlined how the United States had to get involved with the Mujahideen to fight against the Soviets covertly. The Soviets found out that the United States is actually fighting or covertly helping the Mujahideen. That's World War III, wouldn't you think? And at that time, there was also a peace treaty between the Soviet Union and the United States, which was a pact called the Mutually Assured Destruction Pact, where both sides agreed that if there was a nuclear fight, that neither side would win. Both sides would be destroyed. There would be no winner, and so that was the name of the treaty that both countries had signed. Needless to say, the Cold War was still the enemy of the United States and the enemy of the free world, according to the free press, or the free press at the time, which later becomes the legacy media. And so the Soviets, the Pakistanis, who were afraid of the Soviets because they feared that if they beat Afghanistan, Pakistan would be next. And after Pakistan, it would be Iran. And so that they would control the Caspian Sea, and if they controlled the largest oil reserves in the Caspian Sea, Soviet Union could be the sole superpower. So the United States got involved with the CIA using Operation Cyclone to funnel millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars, Stinger missiles, weapons right through the Pakistan border. Pakistan ISI started funding the Mujahideen using these weapons, which are coming from the United States. And on top of this, you had the Saudis, rich Saudi donors from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, who sympathized with the fight against the Soviets, and they were funneling to the tunes of tens of millions through the Maktab al Kidmat office in Pakistan and the Maktab al Kidmat offices in New York, which is the Al Khifa Refugee Center, which I spoke about some length yesterday. Bin Laden himself started becoming a really big name in Afghanistan because of this war and because of the battle at the Al Masada training camp. And then um, there was a battle which was supported by the Pakistan ISI, um, which would have the the ire of um, the Arabs. Sorry for the momentary lapse of reason. Um, in 1979, the Afghan battle this time was multiple contingents of Arabs and Afghans, um, which saw the defeat. Um, I'm I think I'm saying it incorrectly. The name, I think it's the Battle of Jaji. Uh, Let's say it's a Battle of Jaji, in which the Pakistani ISI, through Hamid Gul, started involving themselves without the approval of Prime Minister Benazir Bhutto in helping the Mujahideen repel the communists. And at this time, the Soviets had agreed to retreat out of Afghanistan, but there was a huge contingent of communists in Afghanistan that were still fighting the Mujahideen, who were trying to rid communism out of Afghanistan. And so the Afghanistan government under Burnham Rabbani tried to quell things and tried to um, decentralize the Mujahideen and the communist bloc. However, there was a large influence in Afghanistan that started coming into the late 1980s, but they made their presence known in Afghanistan in 1992, and it came from the madrasas in Jalalabad and in Islamabad and from Peshawar. And this group of people would become known as the Taliban, headed by a notable imam, a very mysterious person at the time, which nobody really knew much about, and his name was Muhammad Mullah Omar. Um, Mullah Omar was a very influential figure. He believed that Afghanistan had to be ruled by um, the Hanafi school of thought, and that they would be the primary institute to employ this. And all they wanted was Afghanistan to be ruled as a caliphate, which was basically a country ruled under Islamic law, Sharia law. Didn't want to expand its borders. That was it. They didn't want anything else. So they joined in on the fight against the communist regime. And at the Battle of Judge, it basically was a huge loss. Osama bin Laden was involved, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar was involved, Abu Haraj al Iraqi, um, and the Pakistan ISI. And this was a huge insult because they got crushed in this fight. The communist bloc of Afghanistan won, and they crushed them, and it was a huge defeat. This was a really huge defeat, and it really altered what I'm about to say for the future, because what happened here was that Bin Laden had said that the Afghans were fighting without God on their side, and that they thought that the only way to win against the Soviets, the secular communist bloc, was to have fighters willing to believe in something rather than nothing. They did believe that they're fighting for something, which was the rebellion of communism, but it wasn't enough. And so this created a fervent belief within Arabs themselves. Now, there was still a large contingent of Arabs, even though the Soviet military had retreated at this point. Um, and now there was another civil war happening inside Afghanistan, and this was between the Northern Alliance and the Taliban. You have that on top of each other. And these civil wars basically were worse than the 10-year war with the Soviet Union and Afghanistan. It created bloodshed and atrocities all over the country. And it basically was because you have these Afghan clans, and there was so many of them fighting for small territory wars. Meanwhile, the Arabs, through the influence of bin Laden and the Egyptians, which were coming into the country at the time, who basically manipulated the ideology of bin Laden. At that time, bin Laden didn't have Al Qaeda. He created an organization called Al Qaeda, but it wasn't an actual organization just yet. They didn't have any political strategy or any type of military strategy. It was basically an organization for Arabs, which were basically training Arabs and Afghans in the arts of small guerrilla warfare, not global terrorist operations, as the historians would like to tell you. Um, but in regards to the ideology, this would later become twisted. Now, I have to schedule the importance of the Egyptians here. At this time, bin Laden and the group called Al Qaeda, which was basically a group headed under two committees, a Shura committee and a military committee. Later, we would have other committees like a media committee, a widow committee for men who would lose their lives during the combat against the communist bloc in Afghanistan. And they would have other smaller committees. But the major committees inside Al Qaeda are the Shura Committee, which is the Religious Authority Committee, and the Military Committee. In regards to the the Shura Committee basically was headed under a number of people, um, specifically Ayman al-Zawahiri, Said Imam al-Sharif, who I spoke about at some length. I did a video about him. He's an important figure, and nobody really knows anything about him, but he created the doctrine that would later be used by jihadists in the early 1990s, such as Al Qaeda and the Taliban and Boko Haram later, um, um, Abu Sayyaf in the Philippines, Jemaah Islamiyah in Indonesia and the Philippines. A lot of these organizations that have connections to Al Qaeda. Needless to say, the Egyptians come in late 1980, 1990, and the Egyptians are coming from the jails of Egyptian jails like Torah prison, which was basically a brutal prison headed under the Egyptian security services or the SSI, which were known to torture um, just anyone involved with these terrorist organizations like Al Jihad, which later became the Egyptian Islamic Jihad, and Gamma Islamiyah. These were the main groups in Egypt that were conducting terrorist operations against the secular government of Anwar Sadat, Gamal Abdel Nasser before him, and Hosni Mubarak later. But when Sadat was assassinated in 1980, the SSI basically arrested hundreds of people. And two people that they arrested would later have huge ramifications for the United States and the world. And the two people that they arrested were Omar Abdul Rahman of the Gamma Islamiyah and Ayman al-Swahiri of Egyptian Islamic Jihad. But both of these people would be released later. And Omar Abdul Rahman was a known terrorist. Ayman al-Zawahiri wasn't. He actually went to Pakistan because he's a doctor and he helped at the Red Crescent. Omar Abdul Rahman basically went to the United States with the help of the CIA, who gave him a U.S. visa, even though that he was a known terrorist. I spoke about this at length yesterday as well. I won't get into that. So he goes to the United States. Meanwhile, Ayman al-Swahiri goes with Saeed Imam al-Sharif to Pakistan. Both are doctors. They want to help the Mujahideen injured in the fight against the communists in Afghanistan. This is huge because both of these men, as well as other Egyptians that come later, like Abu Banshir, Abu al Banshiri, Abu Hafs al Masri, who would later rename himself Muhammad Atef, who would later become the military commander of Al Qaeda in later years, and a slew of other Egyptians would then come to Afghanistan and Pakistan and meet with bin Laden. And it was these people who brought this ideology of the near enemy and the far enemy approach, in which they wanted to overthrow secular Arab governments and replace them with Islamist ones. And when they created a larger caliphate, they would then attack the United States and Israel, which are the far enemy. And so they brought this ideology and their version of the Wahhabi ideology, in which bin Laden knew very little about, and manipulated bin Laden and used his finances and his power and his influence and the Mujahideen and the Al Masada training camp to go a different direction. And that direction took him to the Sudan. And in 1992, bin Laden was expelled out of Saudi Arabia. And I spoke about this at length in my very first live video about why he was expelled. And that was because it was alleged that Iraq had wanted to invade Saudi Arabia next after invading Kuwait, who thought they were drilling underneath the pipelines into Iraq. And that's why they invaded Kuwait. And there was false intelligence purported by the State Department and the Russians who found out about it, that there was a large contingent of the Ba'athist Iraqi army at the border of Saudi Arabia. And the Saudis held a very important meeting, an emergency meeting of the Sudari Seven, which are basically the seven lines of the founder of Saudi Arabia, um, King Saud bin Awad al Saud. And so they had a meeting with the General Intelligence Directorate, Prince Turki bin Faisal, as well as the military committee, and said, what are we going to do about a real army that's going to attack us? Saudis don't have a standing army. They really don't have one to speak of. And so bin Laden had visited the kingdom and basically said he would offer his services of the Mujahideen and members of the Al Masada camp, which would later become Al Qaeda, and said that they would defend the kingdom. And they looked at him in horror and said, no, my goodness, we don't want, you to defend us. We need a real military. And so they put him under house arrest because they still feared him and they feared his influence. They feared his family. Even though his family weren't terrorists or anything like that, or affiliated with Osama at this point, really. And so the United States, which basically built the pact with Saudi Arabia at the time, they offered their services and they entered the kingdom. Bin Laden basically called outrage on this, and so did a lot of Saudi imams that basically sympathized with bin Laden and sympathized with the Wahhabi movement. And they started spreading rumors about the kingdom, saying that they would be coming under the influence of the Zionist and Crusader governments of the United States and Israel. And so when the United States became stationed in the two holiest cities in all of Islam, which is Mecca and Medina, it caused a global outrage. And so, according to Peter Lance, who wrote the book A Thousand Years for Revenge, he basically says that Prince Turki al Faisal, the head of the General Intelligence Directorate, gave bin Laden an ultimatum who said that we would unfreeze your assets and give back your passport if you left the country. And he did. He went to the Sudan. And along with him came the members of the Al Masada camp, the members of the Wal Jihad training camp, as well as the Egyptians. And at this time, there was over about approximately 500 to 700 people under his power, with Ayman al-Zawahiri becoming an even more influential figure in bin Laden's life. While in the Sudan, the CIA follows bin Laden and they closely monitoring him because they want to know more about this man who basically helped in the fight against the communist bloc of Afghanistan in the mid 1980s, who had helped build the Maktab al-Khidmat Afghan training offices in Peshawar. Who is this influential figure? The CIA begins collecting human intelligence on bin Laden while he's in the Sudan under the tutelage of National Islamic Front leader Hassan al-Turabi, who is one of the most influential figures in all of Islam, who basically goaded bin Laden to come because he knew bin Laden had a lot of money and bin Laden spent millions of dollars and to the tune of over approximately anywhere between 60 to 80 million dollars was spent in the Sudan building the infrastructure, building roads, building stores, building businesses, all the likes. Well, at this time, under this show of empathy by bin Laden, at the same time, he was also building training camps in the Sudan. Large training camps headed under the tutelage of Ali Muhammad, who at this time was a triple spy for the CIA, the FBI, and bin Laden, and Omar Abdul Rahman, as well as Abu Hafs al-Masri and Abu Ubaidah al-Bashiri. Abu Ubaidah al-Bashiri was considered the brains of the military committee of Al-Qaeda. And at this time, nobody knew what Al-Qaeda was. It wasn't in the papers. It wasn't in the media. There were no terrorist organizations during the late 80s, early 90s for the exception of the Abu Nidal organization, which wasn't a religious organization to speak of. They were a paramilitary organization that was operating inside the United States, Israel, Lebanon, Syria, Germany, um, Jordan, and they were conducting guerrilla warfare on U.S. interests and as well as Israeli interests um, in Italy, in Germany, and they were considered a large scale terrorist organization, but they didn't have the real global fear that later Al Qaeda would have. And so while they were building the infrastructure of Sudan, Al Qaeda started slowly integrating into a political entity, a political threat, if you will. Um, it was around at the same time in the early 1990s that on December 20, specifically on December 29th, 1992, it is alleged that Al Qaeda had launched its first attack, which was the 1992 Yemen hotel bombings, in which two bombs had detonated in Aden, Yemen, which was basically the uh, the second launch pad of Al Qaeda. In fact, Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, which is the largest Al Qaeda organization in the world today, and they aren't the Al Qaeda is no longer the international threat it once was, I guess. But this is the largest group in Al Qaeda in the world right now, and they have a large influence in Yemen. They always did. They always have. Um, and so this was considered the first real terrorist act of Al Qaeda. Um, the bombing actually threatened American tourism in the country, which is the reason why for the bombing was that they wanted to put fear into American tourism. At this time, Bin Laden is still denigrating the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia because still at this time, even after the defeat of Iraq in the first Gulf War in 1991, they were still there in 1992 and 93, and the U.S. military was still there. And this really enraged bin Laden and the Arabs and even some um, Saudi imams who were sympathizing with bin Laden and Al Qaeda at this time, because at this time it is alleged that there was some other financing coming in besides bin Laden's majority of his holdings at the Saudi bin Laden group. There was a number of Saudi imams that were funneling money, millions of dollars, to not just Al Qaeda, but to other terrorist organizations around the world. And the reason for this was really blackmail. What the Saudi government didn't want was basically these terrorist groups who had the United States in the country to come back and bomb them. And so what they were doing was basically funneling to the tunes of millions of dollars to these terrorist organizations in the hopes of them not bombing the kingdom. You ever notice that around this time, with the American presence in Saudi Arabia wasn't even attacked. Sounds familiar? Neither was Israel. Makes you think, huh? Um, but during the mid 1990s, the CIA was compiling data on Al Qaeda. They were noticing that bin Laden is more than just a money man, that he is somebody who's important, somebody who could be a threat down the road, but they never shared this data with the FBI. The NSA, I spoke about this at length in the two live videos that they had they were monitoring bin Laden's satellite phone, and there was a satellite phone given to him from 1992 to 1998, where he no longer uses the satellite phone, and so he was using this. Um, in 1996, Osama bin Laden gave his first fatwa, and the fatwa was entitled "Declaration of Jihad Against the Americans Occupying the Land of the Two Holiest Sites," and it's a 20-page document which is translated from the Arabic. in which it details in short order about how the Arabs need to rise up as a global ummah and and pressure the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia to push out the American influence in the Arabian Peninsula because they saw this as an affront that we had another secular invader occupying not just a Muslim land like Afghanistan with the Soviets, but even worse, the holiest sites in all of Islam, Mecca and Medina. However, a majority of the Sunni countries saw bin Laden as nothing more than a wanton nobody trying to get the attention that he sorely wants. And a lot of these Arab countries were basically in the pockets of NATO, the United States, Israel, the Gulf partners like Syria, like Jordan, Yemen, Libya. Muammar Gaddafi actually is the very first person in the world to offer a warrant for bin Laden's arrest. I think that was in 1993, I want to say. He actually had a warrant for bin Laden's arrest about terrorism. Can you believe that? Muammar Gaddafi. And who do we kill later? Muammar Gaddafi. It doesn't make sense, right? Yeah, go look that up. I think it's 1993 or 1994, something like that. He had a warrant for his arrest. Um, Surreal as it may be. Oh, I see there's people in the room, 4 people. I want to be more um, accessible to the people who are watching this video. The other 2 videos was really concentrating on the content instead of looking at the comments. People have questions. I'll try to answer them after I'm done here. Um, so in the mid 1990s, the CIA and the intelligence community become involved about Al Qaeda and Bin Laden. Bin Laden is changing his whole essence about what Al Qaeda was about, and Al Qaeda still wasn't a terrorist group at this point. And although they were attributed to the bombings of the Yemen hotel bombings, it's considered just a guerrilla attack. It wasn't until this ideology from the Egyptians permeated with Bin Laden and the Arabs, the Mujahideen Arabs, the foreign Arabs, and reshaped the thinking of Al Qaeda. Now, this also at the same time, and I spoke about this in the Sayyid Imam al Sharif video. Al Sharif was really was really becoming concerned about what Al Qaeda and the Egyptian Islamic Jihad were doing, and was that they were willing to kill civilians to cause or to sow discontent and terrorism within the countries that they wanted to change. And so, because according to Imam al Sharif, excuse me, he said in the Quran, it is forbidden to kill life without the justification for it. In the spoils of war, yes, it's unfortunate you have to kill your enemy, but you leave the civilian population alone. You don't enslave them like the Crusaders did to the Muslims in the Crusader Wars, or later during the Ottoman Empire in the fights against the Saudis, where the Ottomans basically repelled against the Saudis until the British government came along and helped the Saudis upend the Ottoman Empire. But he didn't like where the Egyptian Islamic Jihad, especially under Ayman al-Zawahiri, were going with it. And so what they did was basically Sharif disassociated himself and said that they're becoming too militant. And that's exactly what happened. And that wasn't the initial idea of Al Qaeda. And like I said before, Al Qaeda was built from a training camp called Al Masada, which was basically built specifically for Arabs and later trained Afghans in guerrilla warfare, in the arts of guerrilla warfare. That was it. And like I said, it wasn't until the Egyptians came and promoted the ideology of takfiri, which is apostasy, to apostatize other Muslims as not being Muslim. That's what the word takfiri means. And the Egyptians are takfiris. This group did, Egyptian Islamic Jihad. They practiced that. Bin Laden didn't practice that until much later under the tutelage of Ayman al-Zawahiri. And so the Sudan, under pressure from the State Department under President Clinton, had to expel bin Laden out of the country. And this was important. This was huge because at this time, the CIA was growing concerned about Al Qaeda becoming too big for their own good and that they were going to start, um, terrorist operations abroad. But nobody was listening because nobody really cared. This wasn't, important enough. At this time in New York specifically, they were more worried about La Cosa Nostra or the Italian mafia more than they were about, Bin Laden. In fact, the FBI in 1996 and 97 basically asked the CIA, "Oh, who's this Bin Laden guy?" They were just playing catch up. The CIA knew who he was, and it wasn't until they started sharing their files with them that the FBI in New York were becoming more concerned about him too. Um, the next operation was 1996, and it was the Bajinka plot. Now, Bin Laden had no direct connection to this, but this was a plot that is attributed to Al Qaeda anyway, because people like to say that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed is Al Qaeda, but at this time he wasn't Al Qaeda. In 1996, he was a freelance contractor. So was Ramzi Youssef. But 1996, after the first fatwa in the Bajinka plot, one of the objectives was to assassinate U.S. President Bill Clinton, and they couldn't get to him. Security details too tough. Bill Clinton was visiting Manila in 1996, and that's where they came up with the idea, but they couldn't do it. And then the very first real terrorist operation begins, and that's on August 7th, 1998. And that's the Al Qaeda U.S. Embassy bombings in North Africa, Tanzania, and Kenya. This bombing is attributed to Al Qaeda. Now, at this time, bin Laden is actually in Afghanistan. He's welcomed there by the Taliban. The Taliban have a different view of school of thought regarding bin Laden. I outlined this earlier. And so they knew that he was causing trouble with the West because he gave his first fatwa. And so they put bin Laden in a house in, forgot the name of the province. I think it's Nangarhar province again, Nangarhar province, where he was housed with Ayman al-Zawahiri and the rest of Al Qaeda. And so he's bringing money to the Taliban to the tunes of tens of millions. Who at this time, also, I must mention, the bin Laden family issued a statement to the State Department, and this is read through cables that were coming out of the embassy in Peshawar and Riyadh, was that the bin Laden family basically blacklisted Osama bin Laden from having any connection with the Saudi bin Laden group. And I think I have to mention that because it's important, because the majority of bin Laden's money in the early 1990s was coming from his father's construction group. So where was he getting money from? This is important because this would show a connection to terrorism, right? Well, the money was coming from Saudi Arabia, even though Saudi Arabia basically wanted nothing to do with bin Laden, but there was a number of Saudi imams as well as charity fronts inside the United States that was acting as money fronts, money launderers for Al Qaeda as well. And these fronts long existed before Al Qaeda did. And there's large scale charities located in New York, Detroit, Oklahoma, Los Angeles, Texas, Houston, and Michigan. And these are all fronts that funnel money to organizations affiliated like Al Qaeda. And even though that they had no direct connections with them, the money was like a trickle down effect. Just like with the CIA was giving money to the Pakistan ISI, and there was a trickle down effect that saw that money go to Osama bin Laden. And a lot of people like to say, "Oh, Osama bin Laden is a CIA agent." No, he never was, and that's where the misconception comes from. Did money come from the CIA that went to Bin Laden? Yeah, but indirectly. Bin Laden wanted nothing to do with the West, actually, nothing. And that came out later in Ayman al Swahiri's book called Knights Under the Prophet's Banner, in which he wrote a book. And one of it was the conspiracy surrounding Bin Laden. And one of them was CIA asset, that he was a CIA asset. And Ayman al Zawahiri, the second in command of Al Qaeda, said, no, that's not true. We never accepted a dime from the West. So, unless you're willing to, unless the conspiracy theorists, the fringe conspiracy theorists are going to say that Al Qaeda's in on it, I don't know what to tell you. But I think that's a little bit of a laugh, actually. I'm a conspiracy theorist, but I'm not a fringe conspiracy theorist. Like, I don't believe in the fantastical. I only go by, what I can know, not what I believe. And what I can know is evidentiary, what you can prove through reading material, documents, files, and whatnot, reference materials, sources. Um, so the Taliban, let's go back. The Taliban wanted bin Laden to just remain quiet. And meanwhile, they had their own fight, and which is the Northern Alliance, headed by Ahmad Shah Massoud, for the northern part of Afghanistan. And it was a bloody civil war. Mohammed Rashid Dawood, I'm sorry, uh, Rashid Datsim, who's basically an Afghan military commander, an infamous one and a legendary one, was helping Ahmed Shah Massoud to try and repel the large contingent of the Taliban at this time, which are the largest fighting force in the country itself. At the same time, they were using Bin Laden's money to build training camps for the Taliban as well as Al Qaeda. Al Qaeda built a couple of training camps. One of them was Tannak Farms, and another was Al Farouk. And they were training in guerrilla fighting and guerrilla warfare, just like Al Masada was, right? But this time, the enemy is not the communists. This time, under the influence of the Takfiri Egyptians, now the enemy is the United States and Israel. Remember the ideology I told you, the near enemy, the far enemy. The goal of the Takfiris, the Wahhabis, was so that they could beat the secular Arab governments, create a large caliphate, which was the Middle East, into an Islamic one where they could fight against the West, the far enemy, Israel, the United States, the coalition, just like in the pre Crusader days, where you had the Islamic army and the Crusaders for the fight of Jerusalem. That's what these people, these demented worldview of bin Laden actually thought was going to happen. But instead, he wanted to speed up the process because to defeat the secular Arab governments would take decades. And the Egyptians couldn't beat Hosni Mubarak in Egypt. And they had, groups like Gamma Islamiyah and Egyptian Islamic Jihad who were, tried to defeat the government and they couldn't. So bin Laden saw this, and Ayman al Zawahiri knew this and said, let's just attack U.S. interests abroad and see if we could change their mind. Well, that happened with the 1998 U.S. Embassy bombings. And after this, now the global community as a whole wanted to know who Osama bin Laden was. Who was this guy? Now the attention's on to them. And the Taliban, they saw this and they said, oh my God, we don't want the West coming here. They'll destroy us. Even though they hated the West, didn't want any influences of any foreign invaders in Afghanistan. They didn't care what you did in any other country. Meanwhile, the Taliban at this time was also being secretly funded by who? Saudi Arabia and the Pakistan ISI. And it's rumored that Pakistan ISI really was the Taliban. That's what gave them that start in these madrasas in Jalalabad and Islamabad. And that's probably true because later on, the Pakistan ISI would actually create a terrorist group, called Jaish-e-Mohammed, which is based in India to fight against the Indian for the fight of Lahore and Kashmir. No joke. ISI is a nefarious organization. and I wrote a article about it, the history about it, and it's like 30 minutes long. They are a nefarious group. And it's also alleged that never in their history has an agent ever been capped alive. No agent from the ISI has ever been captured alive, which is stunning when you think about it. An intelligence agency that's been around for 60 years, now it's like 80. That's never had a person ever captured alive. That's amazing. Anyway, um, so the U.S. is now focusing on trying to repel bin Laden. And so the CIA is now given the task to come up with a plan to try and find out more about this group, Al Qaeda and bin Laden. And so they tried to get informants um, within these Afghan tribal warlords to try and get close to them, to try and build base stations near, like in Pakistan or in the Nagar province in Afghanistan. They couldn't, they really couldn't infiltrate these groups. I think that they did, especially Al Qaeda, which basically, has a lack security detail. I mean, I mentioned this about how easy it is to infiltrate the group using Arab intelligence, like the Mukbarat in Egypt or Jordan, or the General Intelligence Directorate, or the Macbeth in Saudi Arabia. Arab-speaking agents could infiltrate these groups and do whatever they can with them internally, or to collect this data information. The Taliban held a meeting with the Taliban High Committee in Afghanistan that came from Pakistan, and they basically um, had a meeting about bin Laden. And bin Laden was becoming a headache to the Taliban. They didn't really like him. They didn't like what he was about. They didn't really care about his war against the West, even though they would give undue attention to Afghanistan, which they didn't want in the first place. And they basically said that if we hand over bin Laden to the West, the Muslim world would basically condemn the Taliban and say that they're munafiq or fake Muslims, because to hand over a fellow Muslim to a non-Muslim, especially to Israel or to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia or to the West, the United States, would basically be like a crime in itself. And so they came to the conclusion that yes, even though he's a headache, we can't expel him from Afghanistan according to Pashtunwali law. Now, the reason why I mentioned this early in the video, because it's important, because according to Pashtunwali law or to traditions, is that whenever a Muslim comes to your house as a guest, you are to never reject him. And so Mullah Omar respected the Pashtunwali code and didn't expel bin Laden based on the Pashtunwali laws, and as well as to um, the commands of the Taliban High Council regarding that they can't hand over bin Laden to a non-Muslim entity. Can't do it because of the ramifications that would come from it. That didn't stop from bin Laden to stop talking to the media, and so he did. He actually held a media interview with Peter Bergen, and that was before. I'm sorry, I should have mentioned this before. That was before the 1998 East Africa bombings. He held a media interview with John Miller and Peter Bergen of CNN. And after the East Africa bombings, they said no more fatwas, no more media interviews, no more nothing. Just sit in your house and be quiet. Right? Basically did that. What happens? In 1998, another fatwa comes about, and this was a fatwa called Jihad Against Jews and Crusaders. And it was signed by Sheikh Osama Bin Laden, Ayman al-Zawahiri, Sheikh Mir Hamza, and Fazl Rahman, as well as Abu Rafai Taha, who is part of the Egyptian Islamic group. And basically, this fatwa was much worse than the first fatwa, because in this fatwa, bin Laden said, basically, kill Americans and Jews wherever you find them around the world. It was basically a war against non-Muslims around the world. This was like the death knell for you know Al Qaeda, because now the CIA was basically had enough. They wanted to create a war with Al Qaeda, and in 1999, the CIA under Director George Tenet, who took over the CIA, and basically wanted to reform the CIA into a more military unit. And so what he did was basically, which caught him a lot of flack with the field office of the CIA. He basically got rid of a lot of the legendary officers, or basically the soldiers or the ground troops of the CIA. And what he hired was called the third floor. And the third floor basically refers to management, CIA management. And he was known as a pure management guy. He rubbed shoulders with the biggest heavyweights in Washington. He lasted from the Clinton administration to the Bush Jr. administration. He was given the Bush Medal of Freedom, Tenet, a war criminal, George Tenet, the Medal of Freedom. It's just absurd in their own right. Anyway, he creates a plan called the Plan. It's called the Plan, and the plan was basically to have the CIA build base stations in Afghanistan and try to infiltrate Al Qaeda using informants. And they tried to do this even with the help of counterterrorism chief Kofor Black, who he hired to head the station. And Kofor Black basically was another company man, and wasn't too friendly with the case officers of the CIA, like Gary Bernstein, um, Gary Schroen, Hank Crumpton. Even though he's a legendary case officer, he became head of the Strategic Activities Division, which was built in 2002, which is a very covert CIA group, and that was basically in charge of Operation Jawbreaker. Al Qaeda at this point was no longer a nondescript movement. It now was a terrorist organization which was creating smaller groups in the Arabian Peninsula, North Africa, and creating affiliates with Al Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent, Al Qaeda in the Indian Maghreb, Al Shabaab based in North Africa, the Jamaat Islam al Muslimin, the Al Qaeda in Kurdistan, Al Qaeda in Lebanon, Al Qaeda in Spain, Al Qaeda in Sinai, Al Qaeda in the Caucasus and Russia, the Balkans, Chechnya, and also having connections with the Fatah al Islam, Jaish Muhammad in Pakistan and India, Jama Islamiyah, Lakshya al Taiba in Pakistan, Abu Sayyaf in the Philippines, the Islamic Jihad in Yemen. All these groups, all these terrorist groups, all have like a connection, and they're being primarily funded from Islamic charities worldwide, as well as a good number of funding coming from the imams in Saudi Arabia and princes from the Sudari 7 line. And these are multimillionaires, even billionaires, who are sending money in the form of blackmail for them not to attack the kingdom. So tens of millions of dollars were coming from all over the world to these groups. And Al Qaeda was at the forefront because bin Laden is the face at this time, because now the CIA and the FBI and the NSA and the State Department want to know bin Laden, and they want to create a war. And in 1999, Al Qaeda said that they are at a war with Al Qaeda. The CIA said this. Director Tenet, in a national security briefing, said, "We're at war with Al Qaeda." A number of terrorist activities happened, including the 2000 Millennium Plots, which is a multi-layered plot, which was to bomb LAX, Los Angeles International Airport, to bomb the Radisson Hotel in Jordan, to bomb Israeli areas along the border of Lebanon and Israel. And this plot was known to the FBI, and they arrested one notable member called Ahmed Rassam. Ahmed Rassam laid out the details of the plot, who was behind the plot, and one of the more nondescript names at the time, who would later have a huge influence later on, who was involved with the Millennium Plot in regards to the Jordanian bombing of the Radisson Hotel, was a name who goes by Abu Musab al Zarqawi. Now, if that sounds familiar to you, Abu Musab al Zarqawi was leader of the Jamaat al Tawhid group, which later became the Islamic State of Iraq, which later became the Islamic State in the Levant. But at that time, Abu Musab Zarqawi was basically under the tutelage of a notable Salafi ideologue named Muhammad al Makdisi, who's considered at that time the most dangerous Muslim in the world at the time, radical Muslim anyway, even more so than Bin Laden, because he had a large following in Jordan and in Lebanon at this time. But Bin Laden basically, is the face of terrorism. He replaces the Cold War, and he replaces Abu Nidal of the Abu Nidal organization as this great enemy we need to defeat, and we need to concentrate the intelligence committee on this group. The USS Cole is bombed at the port of Aden in Yemen in January of 2000, which is basically an FBI matter because it's a federal matter because it happened on a U.S. military station in Aden, Yemen. The FBI gets involved as well as naval intelligence, and they're threatened in Yemen. John O'Neill, who heads the New York I-49 unit in counterterrorism unit in New York, is basically at under great criticism from Yemen U.S. Ambassador Barbara Bodine, who hated O'Neill and didn't want him in the country, and basically threw him out of the country. And as she did that, elements of Al Qaeda, especially one influence named Wali bin Atash, who goes by the nickname Khalad, who is supposedly one of the masterminds of the USS Cole bombing, as well as two other people who would later be involved with the 9/11 plot, and that would be Khalid al-Mihdhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi, who are involved with Al Qaeda because they served with Al Qaeda in the Chechen War. So here are two Al Qaeda members who have connections with the USS Cole bombing and the East Africa bombings, as well as being involved with Al Qaeda in Chechnya. Meanwhile, they escape out of Yemen, and later on, they become involved with 9/11, especially with the hijacking of American Airlines Flight 77. Al Qaeda is trying to draw the United States into Afghanistan, into a long war. They knew that they couldn't beat Al Qaeda with the military. They didn't have the members, nor the means, or the logistics to fight against the powerful U.S. military and the coalition. Instead, what bin Laden wanted to do was when he bombed the U.S. embassies in Tanzania and Kenya, was that he was hoping that President Clinton at the time would overreact and send the military to Afghanistan. Instead, Clinton sent drone strike, not drone strikes, drone strikes. Yes, drone strikes. I was going to say nuclear drone strikes into Afghanistan on training bases, and one in Sudan, which hit a pharmacy. Wasn't even an Al Qaeda military installment state. It was a chemical weapons factory. It wasn't. It was a pharmaceutical factory that they bombed. CIA is trying to collect as much data as possible. Clinton wasn't that type of reactionary. He wasn't a reactionary type. He had a powerful State Department behind him, a powerful National Security Council behind him, headed under Richard Clarke, as well as Sandy Berger. And so he didn't react the way bin Laden did. And so bin Laden became aware of an idea, allegedly. Let's take this with a grain of salt, because this is coming from Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and Ramzi bin al-Shibh, who were tortured. So we have to use discretion here, okay? So please, this is take with a grain of salt. According to Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, he went to bin Laden with an idea to hijack planes, and he was going to hijack 10 of them and crash them inside the United States. The idea came from an earlier project that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was involved with, and that was Project Bajinka, in which they were going to bomb 12 airliners over the Pacific from Southeast Asia and the United States. This time, one of the facets of Bajinka was they were going to hijack a plane and crash it into CIA headquarters in Langley, and that one of the members of the Bajinka plot, Abdul Hakim Murad, who was interviewed by the Philippines investigators, said that there were sleeper cells in the United States in the mid 90s. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed went to bin Laden with the idea and said, we could use planes, we could hijack them and crash them into, sensitive targets in the United States and cause a reaction then. And bin Laden bin Laden at first rejected the idea. And the second time, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed went to him. He accepted waste too much time because I'm like an hour and 10 minutes in. And so Al Qaeda was being monitored by the intelligence world at this time, mainly the CIA and the NSA. Whether the Israeli Mossad was doing it too, whether the Saudi GID was doing it too, I don't know for sure abroad. Inside the United States, that's for sure. Who knows what was being said on bin Laden's satellite phone? Who knows what was being said in the house in Yemen, the Al Qaeda switchboard in Yemen? Were they talking about 9/11? Were they talking about the USS Cole? Were they talking about the embassy bombings? According to the NSA, they might have been. So, was there a conspiracy involving some elements of the CIA and the NSA in allowing these attacks to happen so that they could take advantage of a greater geopolitical purpose inside the Middle East regarding foreign policy? Very well could be. And that sounds pretty reasonable. What do you think? And so Al Qaeda is allegedly involved with the September 11, 2001 attacks. And what happens? Well, the United States does overextend. Bush does overreact, just like bin Laden hoped he would. And just like he predicted back in the mid 90s with Clinton. But he was wrong about Clinton, but he was right about Bush. And not only that, they invaded Iraq too, which was a plus for bin Laden. Because what bin Laden wanted to do with the United States was ultimately this: by engaging in the military in Afghanistan, that the United States would repeat the problems of the past in which they didn't learn, in which the Soviet learned in short order, was that you may have the watches, but the Afghans have the time. And they'll just wait you out and drag you out with a long, prolonged war where you'll spend billions and even trillions of dollars trying to fight against an enemy that wants to die in the first place. In light of a foreign policy that's being shaped at the same time by neoconservative and Likud party interests, as well as Saudi interests, in reshaping the Middle East and getting rid of the old guard, which are the socialists and communists from Arab land, and replacing them with Western influenced Arab leaders. And that's exactly what happened. And Al Qaeda suffered a huge loss after this because even Mullah Omar even remarked in an interview with CNN over the phone, in which he used a translator, he said that they knew that after 9/11, which they didn't know what was happening as it was being constructed, they had no idea. But after 9/11, they found out what was going on, and they basically, had to fight against the U.S. military forces, which invaded Afghanistan first and basically decimated. But according to Mullah Omar, he said after 9/11, we knew we were dead, that bin Laden signed our death warrant. And even then, on the afternoon of 9/11, just as the buildings were hit, the first interview ever given on Western media wasn't from the FBI, wasn't from Bush, wasn't even from Vice President Cheney. It was from the Taliban, in which they basically said that they had no involvement with 9/11, and that if bin Laden had any evidence behind the attacks, they would hand him over to George Bush. Bush, the very next day, said, "We don't negotiate with terrorists." Well, it wasn't like they were going to hand him over anyway, because they were going to hand over bin Laden, and they rejected it at first because the Saudis were going to arrest him. But once the Saudis went and held a meeting with the Taliban about handing bin Laden over, they said they wouldn't hand him over to you because they knew you would hand him over to the West, and that he wasn't involved with prior terrorist attacks because he was under our watch. Now, whether you want to believe that the Taliban basically curtailed bin Laden's terrorist plans in the mid 90s, maybe, maybe not. Maybe they didn't care. Maybe they lied. Who knows, really? But Al Qaeda was decimated. And there was an operation called Operation Jawbreaker, in which I even um, I did a special podcast about this regarding the book written by Gary Bernstein, who's in charge of the operation, which was a large contingent of the CIA and U.S. Special Forces, which invaded Afghanistan and basically decimated Al Qaeda and the Taliban, destroyed good majority of them. However, the Afghans from the Northern Alliance, um, under Hamid Karzai, under Rashid Datsum, the U.S. Special Forces, um, the CIA, had bin Laden surrounded at the White Mountains, the border of Afghanistan and Pakistan. His back was against the mountains. In other words, his back was against the wall. And Gary Bernstein was in charge of the operation called Jawbreaker. He called in to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Richard Myers, and said, "Just give me 200 Special Force fighters to block off the back entrance, and we could kill bin Laden," which was the ultimate goal of the operation. He said no. Bin Laden escapes with the rest of his ragtag bunch of Al Qaeda, which was numbering anywhere now between 50 to 100, which he split into Waziristan, Iran, and Pakistan. Richard Myers said no because he got authorization to say no from the Bush White House. Why did they say no? Why did they say no to the killing of bin Laden? Why did Clinton say no to the assassination of bin Laden from the CIA in the mid 1990s? Why? We may never get the answers to that. But it just seems that wherever Al Qaeda went from the mid 1990s to at least to 2011, when bin Laden was assassinated by U.S. Special Forces, that the intelligence community was side by side with them or just one step behind them. Whether they were watching him from afar, monitoring what he was doing, letting him get away with operations so that they can extrapolate on those terrorist acts to achieve a greater geopolitical goal behind it. Well, like I said, that sounds pretty reasonable to me. And I'll end it at that. I think I said enough about the history of Al Qaeda and the ideological transformation from the very beginning to the influence of the Takfiris in Egypt and to um, the period between 2000 and 2000, early 2000s. Um, do you have any questions? There's 8 people here. If you have any questions, I'll take them. I didn't do this with the last video. I don't know if you have any questions or not, but I don't know what else to say. Hey, Reed, is that Reed? Reed Coverdale, Naturalist Capitalist. Anybody who's in this room, go subscribe to that guy because he's always speaking about me, about my channel in high regards, and I'm always red faced, and I'm a serious person, but I don't do well with compliments. So you know how to make me blush. Reed. So yeah, thank you very much, Reed, for for speaking on my behalf and telling me I'm a good channel. You know, all I am is a regular guy. I'm in my bedroom. I'm talking about, the historical facts of the important issues that relate to today. And, 9/11 is basically, a branch of what's happening today with COVID and everything else that's involved. I don't want to say that word too much because I might get a strike. So I don't want to do that. But keep it simple, stupid, right? Um, yeah. Hey, listen. But if you have any questions, I'll take them now. And or if you have, I don't know what else you want to say, and maybe not. Maybe you went to sleep. I'm like the McNeil or her hour on Channel 13. The news channel. I don't know if that's anymore playing, but if you wanted to go to sleep, you put on a Channel 13 show and you just went right to bed. So it's like that. But no, I try to put out informative content as much as I can and to help in the hopes of educating a public properly and responsibly so that you can do something with the information. Maybe you'll become a more influential channel than myself. I'm not very influential. I'm shocked. I even got 1,000 people, still following me. I can't believe it. Um, but yeah, I would like to have people who follow my channel become educated on the most important topics, and that's why I speak about them. And I'll do more live videos like this. I'll keep doing them if you want me to keep doing them. Usually I do. I started doing in the mornings latest news videos where I read to you the latest news coming out of like European news. I don't like to use news inside the United States because it's so biased and so lacking of real information about the important issues. Unfortunately, I have to go to foreign press and try to read the more important issues to you. And what I do is I read a number of different periodicals and I read them as quote to quote, and afterwards I give my thoughts and notions about what's happening around the world and stuff like that because I want you to become more informed about what's happening, because no matter what's happening abroad is happening in our name, whether you realize it or not. It's in our name. What's happening in Yemen, which is the largest humanitarian crisis in the world, and we're allied to Saudi Arabia, and we're giving money to Saudi Arabia. And we just gave the biggest aid package under the Trump administration to the tune of $103 billion. The majority of that was military aid. Where did that go? Yemen. We're bombing those people, and not just Yemen. We're talking about Pakistan. We're talking about Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya. All those bombings, drone strikes, killing millions of people. In Iraq, it's basically approximately where you listen to is somewhere between 1.3 million to 1.8 million people dead in Iraq. An absurd number, absurd, and yet we're outraged that 3,000 people died on 9/11, and we should be. But compared to that number, we should be we should be in the streets, in which we did in 2002 and 3 when we protested. It was considered still the largest protest of the 21st century, the protest against the Iraq War. We haven't never had a protest since like that. We should against the Pentagon. We should against the Israeli and Saudi lobbies who influence our government to intervene in these wars. They're still trying to commit to war in Iran, North Korea, Russia, China. My God's sakes, we're run by madmen, these sociopaths in federal government. I try to dissuade people not to vote. I'm not a Republican or Democrat. I don't adhere to human principles or ideas or constructs. They're all divisive. I'm an atheist, but Christ once said in the Bible, in the New Testament, and I think it's in Revelations, I didn't come to build a church. In fact, what he wanted was you would pray in silence and alone. And all these evangelicals are antithetical to Christ's teachings. They don't represent Christ. They're a nationalist ideology. That's why they get along with Israel and the Zionists, because they're a nationalist ideology. And their twisted way of thinking about faith involving Christianity is not what's being taught in the New Testament at all. And of course, the Wahhabis of the Saudi government um, are anti-ethical to the Sunni population around the world, and they don't consider them Muslims, and they're not. And yet, Bush once said the axis of evil: Iraq, North Korea, and what do you say? Iraq, North Korea, and Iran. The axis of evil. I'll tell you who the real axis of evil is: the United States, Israel, and Saudi Arabia. That's who the real axis. Why do you think we don't have any hegemony in the region? Now, of course, we do have problems in some of these Arab countries. We do, but they're not to the extent that the U.S. military is building, 300 bases around the world, 300 bases. Can you imagine if Iran had a military base, say in Florida? Can you imagine that? It'd be an act of war. But when the U.S. does it, it's spreading democracy. Yeah, that's my problem. I don't know. No questions. You don't have any questions? What's wrong? You just want me to stop, don't you? I think. All right. I bored you enough. All right. I'll end the stream there. I did speak about Al Qaeda to as a length. I hope it was information. I hope it was informative for you. I really do. In fact, I might be doing more in the future, these live streams, but I don't want to do them as long as this because I feel like an hour and 30 minutes is a long time to listen to me. Maybe I'll make them. I have to make them shorter, but it's hard. It really is hard to talk about like these subjects like 9/11 or like Al Qaeda, the history of Al Qaeda. I got to have some time to talk about these issues to try and bring some context that you're not going to learn really just like anywhere else. Other people are talking about it, but it's very few and far between. And so I want to be responsible in elucidating the information to you because it's you. I don't want to misinform. I don't want to cause disinformation. I don't want to be disinforming the public. I want to inform the public. I want to educate the public because that's how you create a movement where we can do something. Good night, guys.